Hi, I'm Darude and I'm going to show you how I clean up long effect tails potentially mudding up an otherwise great synth sound. Spot the difference here. First, here's the muddier version. And then the cleaner. And the muddier once again. Notice how the tail has a lot of different frequencies and is ringing. And then here is the cleaned up one. Many synth plugins have awesome, huge sounding presets when you play them on their own, but then clog a mix in the full context. It's often because the effects like reverb and delay are a bit over the top, and many synth plugins don't have fully controllable effect parameters with accurate EQ, for instance. To go around this, you can use the synth dry and use your DAW or third-party plugins to recreate those effects, but if they are somehow unique or integral to the sound, then duplicate the synth channel and make one 100% wet channel and the other one 100% dry to get the signals separately and to get great control over the effect level, EQ, width, etc. This sound is from Spire, and I've got actually 3 different channels out of here. I'll explain a little more later. But so here is the first one. This is the dry, right? This is the wet. And then it's actually missing the last note because I made actually 3. So 1 dry and 2 wet. The first wet one is for short reverb decay, so as short and busy notes. And then the last one is basically for the last note of whatever sequence I have going on. And then that has long decay. And that's the part that I'm actually sort of mostly effecting and using in this whole thing. So here's the whole thing all together. So here are the 2 Spire instances, and as you can see on the top one, the delay and reverb are muted, and then on the bottom one, not. On the third one of these, I have about the same settings, except that on the second one, I'm actually playing with the reverb decay a little bit as well on the busier notes. And then this third channel in this spot is actually the one that creates the last note that has a really long decay, but otherwise the 2 wet channels are exactly the same. All right, so what I've done here now, I made 3 tracks that have the same synth, except that the one is dry and then there's 2 that are fully wet. Then I put them in a track stack, and on that track stack, I put the original single track synths, corrective EQ, and some compressor and filter stuff. And then on those separate tracks, the dry one, I haven't really treated at all because that's how it is, and then that's going to be going through the track stack, so it's going to be EQ'd there like it was. But then the wet one, I've actually added a compressor on, and the compressor is getting a trigger from the dry one, and so every time the dry sound is on, it actually ducts down a few dBs off the affected signal so as to make a little more room for the dry sound to cut through. Then when the sound ends and there's a tail on the effect channel, that comes back up and fills the space like it should be. But that way you get a little cleaner mix, and the main sound, the dry lead sound, comes through a little more. Why I have actually another wet channel here as well is because there's rapid succession of notes here and there on this instrument, and I want to use about the same amount of wet reverb sound on those notes, but I want their decay to be short so as not to muddy up those consecutive quick notes. And so the first dry channel is with short decay, and the third one is with a long, whatever, 6 or something seconds long decay tail. And I'm only using that third one on long last notes, that after which are long gaps so as the reverb can play and ring through. So if we listen to the last one only, it's just a long ringing note. And if we take the other wet ones as well. And I've also got a volume automation going on here right after the short notes so that that really doesn't ring at all. And then the last long note with the long tail takes care of the long decay. Like so. And then I've also added a shaper box on the wet channel. And what that does is it adds a pumping effect on the affected part of the sound. So first of all, it creates a little bit of a vibe or sound because it's pumping, you can hear it, but it also helps with the mix. So every time a kick is hitting, there's basically a little more room carved from under it. What I've actually done is it's not 100% pumping so that it's not too dry or too drastic effect, but the low end is fully pumping and it's up to 290 Hertz. And that's ducking all the way down. But then above that, it's only 30% ducking. So you still get the ducking sound and the effect on the low end and the sound overall. So, sidechain duct the wet signal triggering with the dry signal to avoid total effect wash and to get the dry, i.e. the main signal, to cut through a bit better. Even finer tweaking still, by the way, you could do this in dual mono mode that at least Logic has and some other DAWs too. Or another way to split the wet signal to the mid and side components and then carve out space for the lead only from the mid signal or a specific range of it so as to make the carving and the room making even a little more stealth. That way you could leave the sides do their thing, but then when the lead sounds are usually most meaningful and sharpest, hardest, loudest on the mid channel anyways, so then it's the best way to give room for a lead sound without affecting the whole sound or that you would notice that there's something missing from under the dry sound. Then, like I already showed, sidechain duct the wet signal, especially if it's got low end, with an enveloper tool like Shaperbox 2 to create space for the kick. You could also use a traditional sidechain compressor and get it triggered from the kick of the track. Also, perhaps then automate the Shaperbox mix parameter so that in the breakdowns when there's no drums, no kick, so there would be no ducking, and then again back so that when the track drops and elsewhere where you have kick, there would be ducking. Another thing, like I already mentioned, tweak the reverb decay time from short with short consecutive notes to long for the long tail of the last note to keep the sound thicker with reverb yet relatively clean in busy parts, and then to have a lush long tail when there's space for it after like the last note of something. And that was my example here. In this, short decay notes are here, the first two, and then we have the last note that is actually the one that has the long tail with the sidechain pumping on it. So now I divided the signal into 3 different synths, and now I can have total control over many aspects of the dry sound and the affected sound. Okay, now something totally different. Use region automation to make a self-containing effect. In Logic, this is what I'm talking about. Make something go from dry to wet towards the end of the build-up or towards the end of the region, and then throw in a Shaperbox volume shaper and make the tail pump. So here's a nice little cymbal, and it sounds like this when it's dry. It's a reverse cymbal. It brings you to a transition of some sort, but I don't like it all the way dry like that. So I've added a delay unit and a reverb and then a shaper box, and I'll show you what all of they do. The delay, it's simple enough. Adds a delay. Like that. And we're going to go on the region automation side, and now you see it automates the wet and dry parameter, and then we can put the reverb on as well. That's just the reverb I added, and now that goes as well, ramps up to like 50% wet. And then to make it pump, you can see this last green automation towards the end of the region. And now we have sidechain pumping there. So you could use track automation to do it, but in Logic, every time you move stuff after you've added track automation, it asks you a question if you want to or not. But with this, these basically make self-containing nice little sound effects that you can then move and copy and paste freely in the project. And then you can tweak every region's parameters differently. So in one, you can have a longer tail or wetter sound, and one, you know, less pumping, more pumping. And it's really handy and makes for quick, quite easy and straightforward effects sounds that you can also then save channels with those sounds and with the automations, and you can then import them to other projects. Nice. So because the synth trickery, dividing it to several channels, requires somewhat of a lengthy explanation, at least. It's actually quite easy and quick to do, but there's many layers to it, literally and figuratively. You can affect the wet and dry separately. You can make them pump, compress, EQ, do different things with it. So that was, I think, tip number 1, 2, and 3, at least, maybe 4 as well. And then this reverse cymbal plus reverb and delay and shaper box was tip number 5. And I'm going to give you a bonus one still. And I think this is quite an important one in dance music. Dance music is all about kick and bass. Everything sort of builds around them, and they sound good. They make it, you know, move you and vibrate you. And then also mixing wise, they take the most headroom, the most energy is there. So you need to be really careful how to mix them in various ways and how to use them. And I'm talking about a kick here. Remember to check your kick length and adjust it to fit the track or the possible various different parts of the track as well. Usually mixing wise, it should be shorter than we often think, to leave room for the bass sounds and to not just ring through and muddy up the mix. Because they are so integral for dance music, you often tend to just push them up and not think about it too much. And sometimes it might work, sometimes it's not. But they occupy the same frequency ranges in the low end, so you have to be careful for them not to clash. 1, they can make the mix really muddy, and 2, they can also actually cancel each other out and create a really uneven low end for the track. I've got one simple example here, and you can do this in a couple of ways, but my buddy Mayan just released a sample pack. I highly recommend going to check it out. This is a simple kick that I dragged to Quick Sampler in Logic. This is kind of like an 808 type of kick, and I'll just play it for a little bit. Okay, that kick there is quite long. It's actually longer than what the notes are here, the MIDI notes. So one way to do what I am about to do is just use this sample end marker in the sampler, whatever sampler you're using. And I've got a little bit of fade out in the end as well. So here goes. So now it's much shorter. Now it's almost like an 1/8. And if you're after a solid just 808 sound and the kick part of it is the one that gives your track bass as well, this is great. But if you want to do something that has actual bass with a different instrument there, then you can just, you know, shorten it like I did with the sample end marker, or you could use Shaper Box's volume shaper here as well, like this. And I've got another shaper box here just to show you what the sample looks like with this processing on it. So first of all, if I take the compressor off, you see that there is a good bit of attack and then quite a lot of lower body. But then I compress it and add makeup gain. So then the body gets somewhat stronger. But then here, if I put the shaper box into bypass, then you can hear the whole length. And then you can also see the whole length of the sample, and you can hear the hum, and it's just ringing through. Now, putting a bass line on top of that, you could maybe get away with it if it was one note, but if you would start making like a bass melody with it, forget it, they would clash and it wouldn't work. So that's why you would do something like this. And then obviously you would tweak the length to taste. Again, you could not use that shaper box, but you could use the sample end of any sampler basically. This also has a little fade out, so it's not abruptly cutting. You could also do it so that you drop actual audio sample to your arrangement and make the kicks where however you want them to, and then cut it to the length you want, and then create a fade out so that it smooths out the end. Why I actually have this shaper box here, the extra one, is that this is quite crucial, a visual aid, if you will. And you play this, and now you can select what the range that you see is. So here, if I put it 1 bar, you'll see 4 kicks. Now, if I wanted to, I could just leave it like that and be done with it. But then if I put this on and have them short, now you can just also visually see that you have half the beat room to put a bass sound in there. So now we have the kick, and then we'll add bass. And if we the same goes for the bass. Most of my bass sounds, I'm actually ducking down in the beginning of the sound, and then it comes back up, and then it ducks down again when the next kick starts. So these work sort of opposite ways. You want the kick to be short enough, and you want the bass to duck down from under it in the beginning. I'm Darude, and these are the first 5 tips, plus the bonus one that came to my mind when I was asked about sort of my most used or common things that make a big difference in your mixing sound and your overall production quality. Try them out, do it your own way, and if you come up with something good, something similar, or make these somehow better,